Hello everyone, this is video number 3 for Chapter 2, The Planting of English America, and we're continuing to focus on the southern colonies. Maryland is one of the southern colonies, and in 1634, Lord Baltimore founded Maryland at St. Mary's, the fourth English colony, and it was settled as a financial venture for profit and to create a refuge for fellow Catholics. An absentee proprietor, he settled his relatives on large estates similar to those of England's aristocracy, intending to create a feudal domain free from persecution. The majority of the settlers who came were Protestant, and they soon came to resent the Catholic land barons who controlled the colony's political power. Maryland, like Virginia, became a plantation colony reliant on tobacco, indentured labor, and later, African slave labor. Maryland enjoyed religious freedom from the beginning. Lord Baltimore, concerned about potential threats from large numbers of Protestant settlers, codified this into law. In 1649, Maryland's Legislative Assembly approved the Act of Toleration, which was a religious statute guaranteeing religious freedom to all Christians, not Jews or atheists. Both Catholics and Protestants prospered in Maryland, but despite the Act of Toleration, tensions remained and finally erupted into open rebellion by the end of the century. Now let's talk about the West Indies, which was a way station to mainland America. During the 17th century, England's West Indian colonies developed sugar plantations utilizing African slave labor. England's West Indian colonies in the 17th century, not her North American colonies, were the most profitable in the empire. Sugar production required expensive machinery for sugar mills, vast acres to make it economically profitable, and an extensive labor supply, which only the wealthiest planters could afford. By the mid-17th century, annual sugar exports from the British Caribbean approximated 150,000 pounds. By 1700, exports had risen to approximately 50 million pounds. This phenomenal increase was produced by African slave labor, and by 1680, the average planter on Barbados owned 115 slaves. By 1700, African slaves were outnumbering whites by nearly 4 to 1, a fact that alarmed the white planters who were anxious about the potential for slave revolts. Consequently, English authorities established formal codes to define their legal status and their master's power over them. This was called the Barbados Slave Code, and this was passed earlier in 1661 and denied basic rights to slaves and gave masters total control over their labor and the right to inflict severe punishments for infractions. For slaves on a Caribbean sugar plantation, life was short, brutal, and the labor unremitting. In the West Indies, the slave population did not increase by natural reproduction. Now let's talk about establishing North and South Carolina. Establishment of the Carolina colony came after the English Civil War, the Interregnum, and the Restoration periods. In 1629, King Charles dismissed Parliament for what he considered mutinous opposition to his policies and military escapades. In 1640, Charles I recalled Parliament, trying to force it to pass new taxes to finance his agenda, creating an opportunity which the Puritan opposition within Parliament seized. Oliver Cromwell, the great Puritan soldier, then led the Puritan armies against the king in what was known as the English Civil War. The English Civil War ended with the king's defeat and beheading. From 1649 to 1660, Oliver Cromwell ruled England during a period known as the Interregnum. Parliament restored the monarchy in 1660 by appointing Charles II, the son of the dead king, to the throne under certain restrictions. In 1670, Charles II granted a charter to 8 of his court favorites known as the Lords Proprietors, men who had remained loyal to him during the Interregnum period. The charter granted these men a vast expanse of wilderness south of the Virginia colony, an area stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. This is a table that shows all of the 13 colonies listed by name, who founded them, the year they were founded, and the year they were chartered, what type of colony they were, and their status by 1775. And we'll discuss this more in our classroom lectures. The proprietors in the Carolinas sought to establish Carolina as a profitable venture with an exportable crop, which was comparable to the Chesapeake tobacco or the West Indian sugar. The early settlers in Carolina were primarily immigrants from Barbados, those who could not compete successfully within the large sugar planters. Charlestown, on the banks of the Ashley River, became the first permanent settlement in the colony. Barbadian immigrants brought their slaves with them, and by 1700, slaves constituted approximately 50% of Carolina's population. Carolinians eventually achieved success growing rice. Taking advantage of the knowledge the African slaves possessed of rice cultivation, it soon became the colony's cash crop. They exported timber, livestock, and enslaved coastal Indians to Britain's Caribbean colonies, and trade in captive Indians was achieved with the aid of the Savannah Indians. In 1707, the Savannah Indians ended their alliance with the British and tried to migrate to Pennsylvania and the Maryland backcountry. Before the Savannah Indians could escape, the Carolinians attacked them in an effort to thin them out. By 1710, they had virtually annihilated all the coastal tribes in Carolina. Thus, in this manner, Carolina became the first of several restoration colonies. Eventually, England's North American colonies became the breadbasket for her West Indian colonies, while the West Indian colonies became a source of African slaves and other goods for her North American colonies. Carolina grew, and its vast northern wilderness region gradually became a refuge for poor squatters, riffraff, and religious dissenters from Virginia and Carolina. Without legal title to the land, these people established farms where they raised tobacco and other crops free of slave labor. They also developed reputations for resistance to government authority. In 1712, the Crown separated North Carolina from South Carolina, and each became a royal colony. North Carolina eventually earned a reputation for being the most democratic, least aristocratic, and most independent-minded of all the original 13 colonies, followed closely by Rhode Island. By 1720, North and South Carolinians had crushed the Tuscarora and Yamasee Indians, completing the conquest of virtually all the southern coastal Indians. However, in interior Appalachian mountain areas, the powerful Iroquois, Creek, and Cherokee Indians remained, creating an effective barrier that limited English settlements to the eastern coastal plain. Farther south, Spanish Florida and French Louisiana remained constant threats to the security of the Carolinas, particularly during times of war between England and Spain or France. Georgia is the late-coming colony, and it's also known as the buffer colony. Founded in 1733, Georgia, which was named after England's King George II by its proprietors, became a haven for people who were imprisoned for debt, a source of silk and wine, and served as a buffer between the Carolinas and Spanish Florida. Georgia, a cornerstone in colonial defense, received monetary subsidies from England to ensure its success. It was the only colony to receive such early aid. James Oglethorpe, an imperialist soldier statesman, was the best known of Georgia's founding proprietors. Oglethorpe mortgaged his own personal fortune to help ensure the colony's success and, through exceptional leadership, saved the colony by repelling Spanish attacks. Savannah, the first settlement, became a melting pot community of Scots Highlanders, German Lutherans, and others. It welcomed all Christians except for Catholics. John Wesley, a missionary who came to Georgia to work with debtors and Indians, later returned to England and founded the Methodist Church. Georgia was the least populous of the colonies on the eve of the Revolutionary War because, one, its original founders slowed its economic growth by forbidding slavery until 1750, two, because of its unhealthy climate, and three, because of the Spanish attacks against it. All of the plantation colonies have similar things about them. Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia all established economies devoted to exporting commercial agricultural products, primarily tobacco and rice. Slavery existed in all the plantation colonies on widely scattered estates and farms, making it difficult and expensive to support the establishment of schools and churches. An aristocratic atmosphere could be found in all the plantation colonies as well, to a lesser degree in North Carolina and Georgia, because only the wealthy could afford slaves and large tracts of land. And we'll continue to discuss the Southern colonies in our activities in class.